You've probably heard the story before. A man in his 40s, maybe early 50s. He wakes up early, goes for a jog, eats what everyone calls clean, avoids junk food, doesn't smoke, maybe even goes to the gym regularly. His friends describe him as disciplined. His family thinks of him as the healthiest person they know. And then, one morning, without warning, he collapses. A heart attack. No history. No obvious red flags. Just like that, everything changes. It sounds shocking, almost unfair. How can someone who did everything right end up facing something so serious? The truth is uncomfortable, and it goes against the simple narrative most people want to believe. Health is not just what you see on the surface. It's not just about body weight, or how often you exercise, or whether you avoid fast food. There are deeper processes happening inside the body, quiet and invisible, building over years without symptoms, without pain, without any obvious signals, until it's too late. One of the biggest misconceptions people carry is that heart disease only happens to those who look unhealthy. The stereotype is clear: overweight, sedentary, poor diet, maybe smoking. And yes, those are major risk factors, but they are not the full story. In fact, a significant number of people who experience heart attacks don't fit that picture at all. They look healthy by conventional standards. And that's where the real danger lies. Because when you believe you're safe, you stop looking for what could be silently going wrong. Inside your arteries, a process can begin decades before any symptoms appear. It starts with tiny injuries to the inner lining of the blood vessels. These injuries can be caused by things you don't feel, like slightly elevated blood pressure, spikes in blood sugar, chronic stress hormones, or even poor sleep patterns. Over time, these small injuries attract cholesterol particles, particularly LDL. Your body tries to repair the damage, but in doing so, it creates plaque. Layer by layer, year after year, that plaque builds up. What makes this process dangerous is not just the buildup itself, but its unpredictability. You can have arteries that are partially blocked for years without any noticeable symptoms. You can still run, lift weights, and carry on with daily life. But at some point, one of those plaques can rupture. When that happens, your body reacts as if there's a wound, forming a blood clot. That clot can suddenly block the artery completely, cutting off blood flow to part of the heart. That is a heart attack. It doesn't always come with a long warning. Sometimes the first symptom is the event itself. Now here's where things get even more complicated. Many people rely on basic health checks to reassure themselves. They get a standard cholesterol test, and if the numbers fall within a normal range, they feel safe. But traditional tests don't always tell the full story. Two people can have the same LDL level, but very different risks depending on the size and number of LDL particles, their level of inflammation, and how their body processes fats and sugars. These are details most routine screenings don't fully capture. Then there's the role of inflammation. This is something most people rarely think about when it comes to heart health. Chronic, low-grade inflammation can exist in the body without obvious signs. It can be driven by factors like stress, poor sleep, environmental toxins, or even certain dietary patterns that don't seem unhealthy at first glance. Over time, this inflammation makes plaques more unstable and more likely to rupture. So even if someone appears fit and active, if their body is constantly in a state of internal stress, their risk can quietly increase. Stress itself is another underestimated factor. Not the kind you notice for a moment, but the kind that becomes part of your daily baseline. Deadlines, financial pressure, unresolved emotional strain, constant mental overload. When stress becomes chronic, your body remains in a heightened state of alert. Hormones like cortisol and adrenaline stay elevated longer than they should. This affects blood pressure, blood sugar, and even how your blood clots. Over time, it creates an internal environment that is far less stable than it appears from the outside. Sleep is another piece of the puzzle that often gets ignored. You can exercise every day and eat well, but if your sleep is consistently poor, short duration, interrupted cycles, or conditions like sleep apnea, your cardiovascular system never fully recovers. Blood pressure stays elevated at night when it should drop. Inflammation increases. Hormonal balance is disrupted. All of this contributes to the same underlying processes that lead to heart disease, even in people who otherwise seem disciplined about their health. Genetics also plays a role, and it's not something you can out-train or out-diet entirely. Some people inherit a tendency for higher cholesterol production, or a greater likelihood of plaque formation, or a stronger inflammatory response. This doesn't mean lifestyle doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But it means that for some individuals, the baseline risk is already elevated. Without deeper screening or awareness, they may assume they're safe simply because they're doing the right things. There's also a modern paradox worth paying attention to. Many people who consider themselves healthy follow routines that are intense but not always balanced. High-intensity workouts without adequate recovery, restrictive diets that create nutritional gaps, or extreme focus on physical appearance rather than internal health markers. On the surface, these habits look disciplined, but internally, they can sometimes add stress to the system rather than reduce it. The body doesn't just respond to effort, it responds to balance. Another factor that often goes unnoticed is metabolic health. Someone can have a normal weight and still have underlying issues like insulin resistance. This is sometimes called metabolically unhealthy normal weight, and it's more common than most people realize. Blood sugar spikes, even if they don't reach diabetic levels, can damage blood vessels over time. They contribute to the same cycle of injury, repair, and plaque formation that leads to heart disease. But because the person doesn't look overweight, the risk is often overlooked. Even diet, which people feel confident about, can be more complicated than it seems. Labels like healthy or clean don't always reflect how food interacts with your body. Highly processed health foods, hidden sugars, refined oils, and imbalanced nutrient intake can all contribute to long-term issues. It's possible to follow a diet that looks good on paper but still promotes inflammation or unstable blood sugar levels. And then there's the issue of timing. Heart disease is not something that develops overnight. It's a long process, often starting in your 20s or even earlier. By the time someone is in their 40s or 50s, the foundation has already been laid. So when a heart attack happens in someone who appears healthy, it's not that their lifestyle suddenly failed them. It's that the underlying process had been quietly progressing for years, unnoticed and unaddressed. What makes all of this challenging is that the body is incredibly good at compensating. It can adapt to stress, maintain function, and keep you feeling normal even when something is slowly going wrong. There's no alarm system that goes off early enough to force action. Instead, there's a gradual buildup, a silent progression, until a threshold is crossed. This is why relying only on how you feel or how you look can be misleading. Feeling fit is not the same as being protected. Looking healthy is not the same as having healthy arteries. The gap between appearance and internal reality is where many of these unexpected heart attacks occur. The real takeaway here is not to create fear, but to shift awareness. Health is multidimensional. It includes factors you can see and many you can't. It's influenced by habits, yes, but also by habits, environment, and time. When you understand that, you start to see why the simple equation of eat well, exercise, and you're safe doesn't always hold true. And once you start questioning that assumption, it opens the door to a different kind of approach, one that goes deeper than surface level habits and begins to address the hidden layers that actually determine long-term cardiovascular risk. Once you understand that heart attacks are not just the result of obvious, visible lifestyle mistakes, the next question becomes unavoidable. What actually separates the people who stay protected from those who don't, even when they seem equally healthy? The answer is not a single habit or a single test. It's a pattern, one that most people never fully see because they're looking in the wrong places. The first shift is moving from surface level health to internal awareness. Most people track what's easy: weight, gym performance, maybe total cholesterol. But the body doesn't operate on those simple markers alone. Beneath them are more telling signals: inflammation levels, insulin sensitivity, arterial stiffness, and the stability of existing plaques. These are not things you can guess by looking in the mirror or judging how energetic you feel on a given day. They require a more deliberate approach to understanding your body. For example, someone might proudly say their cholesterol is normal, but never look at markers like ApoB or lipoprotein A, which often give a clearer picture of cardiovascular risk. Another person might have perfectly acceptable fasting glucose, but experience large spikes in blood sugar after meals, creating repeated stress on their blood vessels. These hidden patterns don't show up in casual checkups, yet they quietly shape long-term outcomes. Then there's the issue of consistency over intensity. Many people approach health in bursts: strict diets, aggressive workout plans, periods of extreme discipline followed by burnout or neglect. The body doesn't respond well to that kind of inconsistency. What protects the heart is not occasional perfection, but steady, sustainable habits over years. A moderate routine, maintained consistently, often does more than cycles of extremes that look impressive in the short term, but create internal stress. Recovery is where this becomes especially important. Exercise is beneficial, but only when balanced with adequate recovery. Without it, the same activity that should strengthen your heart can instead contribute to chronic stress. Elevated cortisol, persistent fatigue, and low-grade inflammation can all result from pushing too hard without allowing the body to reset. It's a quieter form of strain, one that doesn't get as much attention because it hides behind the image of discipline. Breathing, something so basic it's almost invisible, also plays a role that most people ignore. Chronic, shallow breathing, often tied to stress or poor posture, keeps the nervous system in a slightly activated state. Over time, this affects heart rate variability, blood pressure, and overall cardiovascular resilience. The difference between a body that can switch easily between stress and recovery and one that remains stuck in a low-level fight-or-flight mode is significant, even if it's not immediately obvious. Social connection is another factor that rarely gets discussed in the context of heart health, yet its impact is measurable. Loneliness and isolation have been linked to increased inflammation and higher cardiovascular risk. On the other hand, strong, supportive relationships can act as a buffer against stress. This doesn't mean you need a large social circle, but it does mean that human connection is not just emotionally important, it's biologically relevant. Environmental exposure adds another layer. Air quality, noise pollution, even the amount of natural light you get during the day can influence cardiovascular health over time. Living in a high pollution area, for example, has been associated with increased plaque formation and higher rates of heart disease. These are not factors most people think about when they consider their healthy lifestyle, but they are part of the bigger picture. There's also a psychological dimension that shapes behavior in subtle ways. When people believe they are healthy, they often become less curious, less likely to question their routines or seek deeper evaluation. This sense of security can delay important discoveries. It's not about becoming paranoid. It's about staying engaged enough to recognize that health is dynamic, not a fixed state you achieve once and keep forever. Technology has started to change how some people approach this. Wearable devices, for example, can track heart rate variability, sleep patterns, and activity levels in ways that reveal trends over time. While these tools are not perfect, they can provide insights that were previously unavailable without clinical testing. The key is not to obsess over every data point, but to use patterns to guide better decisions. At the same time, it's important to avoid overcorrecting. Once people learn that hidden risks exist, some swing too far in the other direction. Constant testing, constant worry, chasing perfect numbers. That approach can create its own form of stress, which ironically feeds into the very problem they're trying to avoid. The goal is not perfection. It's awareness paired with reasonable action. Nutrition, when viewed more carefully, becomes less about labels and more about patterns. Instead of asking whether a food is good or bad, it becomes more useful to look at how consistently your diet supports stable blood sugar, low inflammation, and adequate nutrient intake. Whole foods, balanced meals, and attention to how your body responds over time tend to matter more than rigid adherence to any one trend. Another overlooked aspect is timing. When you eat, sleep, and expose yourself to light. Your body follows circadian rhythms that influence metabolism, hormone release, and cardiovascular function. Disrupting these rhythms through irregular sleep or late-night eating can create subtle but cumulative stress. Again, this is not something you feel immediately, but it shapes long-term risk. Family history deserves more attention than it often gets. If close relatives experienced heart disease at a relatively young age, that information should change how proactive you are. It doesn't mean the outcome is predetermined, but it does mean that relying on basic assumptions about health is not enough. In such cases, deeper screening and earlier intervention can make a meaningful difference. One of the most practical shifts you can make is to stop thinking of heart health as a single goal and start seeing it as a system. Blood pressure, cholesterol, blood sugar, inflammation, sleep, stress, movement, they are all connected. Improving one while ignoring the others creates an incomplete solution. Addressing them together, even at a moderate level, builds a more resilient foundation. There's also value in understanding the warning signs that are often dismissed. Not all heart attacks come completely out of nowhere. Some people experience subtle symptoms beforehand: unusual fatigue, shortness of breath during normal activities, mild chest discomfort, or even changes in exercise tolerance. These signals are easy to ignore, especially in people who consider themselves fit. But paying attention to changes, even small ones, can lead to earlier evaluation and potentially prevent a major event. Medical care itself is evolving, and in some cases, more advanced imaging or testing can identify risk earlier than traditional methods. Coronary calcium scoring, for example, can detect the presence of plaque before it causes symptoms. It's not something everyone needs immediately, but for certain individuals, especially those with risk factors that aren't obvious, it can provide valuable insight. Ultimately, the idea that healthy people don't get heart attacks is a comforting myth, but it's still a myth. The reality is more nuanced. Health is not a guarantee. It's a probability shaped by many variables: some visible and some hidden. What you do matters, but so does how your body responds, what you inherit, and how consistently you maintain balance over time. If there's one perspective worth holding on to, it's this. The absence of symptoms is not proof of safety, and the presence of good habits is not absolute protection. What matters is how all the pieces come together over the long term. When you start to see health that way, you move from a false sense of security to a more grounded, informed approach, one that doesn't rely on appearances, but on understanding what's really happening beneath the surface. And that shift, more than any single habit, is what reduces the chances of being caught off guard by something that seemed impossible just moments before it happened.